Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Karen von Hippel, the director at RUSI, and it's an enormous pleasure to be co-hosting this event on India and the United Kingdom in a changing international environment, along with the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. We'll call it MPIDSA for short, which, as most of you know, is one of India's premier defense and security think tanks. Before I start with some comments, I just want to extend my sympathies on behalf of all of RUSI to the people of India for all that you've been going through during these incredibly challenging times. Our hearts are with all of you, and we hope you get to a better stage in this pandemic very soon. We are, of course, hoping to do more on India with our Indian partners in the future, and we hope to be able to host joint events in person as well once we all emerge from this pandemic. As we all know, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was supposed to be in India next week and had to postpone it, and we know that the two prime ministers will have a virtual meeting this month to discuss a number of critical issues. But we felt it was important, our two think tanks felt it was important to host our event as scheduled, given how critical the relationship is and will become between the two countries. And on that point, I think even in spite of the pandemic, I think the last year really has seen a growing focus on the UK-India relationship in a number of areas. We've seen the two countries moving towards a deeper trade partnership. They're working closely on climate change cooperation and vaccine production, so critical. And of course, greater diplomatic engagement. And it's more than we've seen in some time. And we also believe at RUSI, and I'm sure you would agree, that in the coming years, this relationship between the UK and India will really only increase in importance, especially post-Brexit, as the UK tries to implement the integrated review with its tilt towards the Indo Pacific, as we all know. So we're looking forward to today in this webinar exploring a number of these geopolitical and security aspects of the UK-India relationship. Now, we're very fortunate today to welcome both the UK High Commissioner to India and the Indian High Commissioner to the UK. And they both will be joining us to help launch this event, and they'll share some of their top line issues. What I'd like to do is introduce right now the two High Commissioners before I turn the virtual floor over to Ambassador Chinoy. So briefly, Her Excellency Gayatri Isar Kumar is the Indian High Commissioner to the UK. She was appointed in June 2020. She has significant experience in Europe. She served as ambassador to the EU, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and in the Indian embassies in Paris, Geneva, and Lisbon. So she comes well equipped to deal with all of these issues that we will discuss today. His Excellency Alex Ellis is the British High Commissioner to India. He was appointed earlier this year after working as the Deputy National Security Advisor and one of the lead authors of the Integrated Review and probably the tilt, but we'll hear more from Alex in a bit. And he was also Director General in the Department for Exiting the EU for 3 years, as well as Ambassador to Brazil. So significant foreign policy experience and experience in strategic thinking. Now, before we invite the two High Commissioners to speak, I would like to invite our co-host, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, to speak. And let me just say a brief word about him, in case you don't know. He is the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He's been a career diplomat for 37 years, India's ambassador to Japan and Mexico, High Commissioner of India to Belize and the Marshall Islands, and importantly for today's event, he's a specialist on China and has headed Indian expert groups on the India-China boundary dispute, as well as confidence building measures. So also an expert on some of the issues we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Ambassador Chinoy, and then we'll hear from the two High Commissioners. Ambassador. Oh, you're on mute, Your Excellencies. The story of our lives.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. I had pressed the button earlier, but heaven knows what happened. the perils of technology, too much of it perhaps. A very good afternoon to all of you here in India, and a good morning to all of you in the UK. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make a few opening remarks today. I wish to firstly acknowledge the gracious presence of High Commissioner Mrs. Gayatri Sarkumar, High Commissioner Mr. Alex Ellis, and Dr. Karen von Hippel, my co-host. I also take this opportunity to convey our deepest condolences on the recent passing away of His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. This is our very first webinar with RUSI, and I believe it comes not a moment too soon. I really do hope we can meet more often. The virtual medium thrust upon us by the pandemic has actually made engagements relatively easier. Around us, the world is experiencing major geostrategic and geoeconomic shifts. Globalization is under stress. The scale and rapidity of the change in the balance of power in Asia is truly astonishing. But a unipolar Asia is not in our interests, nor are competing versions of exceptionalism. The pandemic has exacerbated many differences. Distressed healthcare systems and economic debilitation have compounded problems. Perhaps there are also some new opportunities for like-minded countries to come together to build a post-pandemic world which is truly inclusive. China's militarism on India's doorstep in the Himalayas was thwarted by the armed forces of India. A strong message was conveyed to Beijing that attempts to change the status quo in the India-China border areas would simply not be countenanced. Further, that peace and stability on our borders is a prerequisite for building all-round cooperation. Friends, the robust response of the Indian Armed Forces was followed by partial disengagement in some areas in Ladakh. India seeks peaceful and cooperative ties with China, but will not sacrifice either territory or self-respect. There are other stress points in our region, from contestation in the Taiwan Strait to tensions in the South and East China Seas. The common thread that runs through these geographies is self-evident. It points to a single source of disruption. The geostrategic scrimmage today is not just about territory. It is equally about tenets. It is a tussle between authoritarianism and democracy. The outcome will have huge implications for all of us, for the entire world in the 21st century. How then do we ensure a better future? Together, we can resist unilateralism and neocolonialism. We should promote connectivity and equitable growth. We must endeavor to mitigate climate change. The pandemic has particularly awakened us to the importance of building resilient supply chains in healthcare as much as in critical technologies. As a post-war phenomenon, the Asia Pacific has evolved. Over time, the Asia Pacific has witnessed the economic rise of Japan, the Asian tigers, and later China as well. It entailed the linking of the great manufacturing centers of that part of Asia to markets across the Pacific. Today, the developmental impulse is more widespread, covering much more of Asia, all the way to the east coast of Africa as well. The Indo-Pacific is a more contemporary and inclusive concept. It reflects a natural transition to a broader definition of growth and development. Friends, geopolitical contestation is here to stay. If the pre-COVID world was competitive, the post-COVID world will prove to be even more so. The UK has shown renewed interest in the Indo-Pacific. The UK is hardly an extra-regional power. It has had a long history in this part of the world, from east of the Suez all the way to Shanghai. Its return to Asia is akin to the proverbial return of the prodigal. This time around, its motives are different, and so is Asia. India and the UK must work together to promote defense, security, economic, and people-to-people ties. We have points of convergence and some points of divergence as well. As we look into the 21st century, it is important for all of us to keep our IFF, that is, identification, friend or foe, transponders, on at all times. On terrorism, our positions should be unequivocal. We must respect the principle of non-interference in each other's internal affairs. As democracies, we must learn to accept and celebrate each other's version of it, just as we do chai and samosas as much as we do the afternoon English tea and scones. Given the rich history of our ties, we are perhaps natural partners. Whether communicating on or off the cricket field, we seem to understand one another. Above all, our defense forces are naturally drawn towards one another, given their rich history and heritage. I am confident that our exchange of views today will strengthen our friendship and cooperation, and we do hope the delayed summit at the level of our prime ministers will elevate our partnership to the next level. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. Can I now invite the Indian High Commissioner to the UK, Her Excellency Mrs. Gayatri Isar Kumar, to speak? You're on mute too. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karen von Hippel, for that introduction. I thank Ambassador Sujan Chinoy. He's used many of the key words that I'm going to be using too, so I'm very glad about that. And High Commissioner Alex Ellis, good to see you. I'd like to, at the outset, thank both the Directors General for co-hosting this inaugural session. And I look forward to seeing and hearing the very, very eminent panelists. The objective, of course, is to initiate a sustained dialogue between think tanks and contributors to policy making on both sides. And this would complement the government-to-government dialogue and partnership across the sectors, which is going to be reflected in the India-UK roadmap to be announced by our Prime Ministers very soon. The timing is just right for the launch of this initiative. We are at an important juncture in India-UK relations. It's clear that current geopolitics and changing equations have shifted the world axis to Asia. And post-Brexit, and in a world impacted by the twin crises of the pandemic and its disruptive effect on the global economy, India and the UK see in each other complementary capabilities that make us natural partners. We found that we could work together very successfully to bring solutions, whether it was in creating flight corridors for safe movement of peoples or essential supplies, or in our triumph in the Oxford AstraZeneca Serum Institute of India collaboration on the vaccine. Towards sustainable development, we are working together in the International Solar Alliance, and we are leading the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, in which we hope to help many other countries who would like to be helped. We are both functioning democracies committed to multilateralism. We're open pluralistic societies, key stakeholders in a rules-based international order and rules-based international trade with WTO at its core. So we consider it imperative to safeguard our shared values and ensure that global governance remains transparent, democratic, and effective for the good of the world and for the realization of the common goals of humankind. Just a year ago, all these values wouldn't have had so much importance and so much need for preservation as they do today. We both agree on the need for reform of the UN and its institutions, and UK supports India's rightful claim for a permanent seat in an expanded UNSC to reflect the ground realities of the world today. And we are coordinating better than ever in the UN. This is also reflected in the integrated foreign and security policy review that lays out UK's global Britain vision with an Indo Pacific tilt. And I thank High Commissioner Alex Ellis for his very perceptive sort of reflections in the report. And this policy review of the UK, we see, envisions a transformational relationship with India. And as UK leads the G7 and COP26, India will be a net contributor in achieving the goals of global economic growth and climate action. India has not only achieved her climate action goals as committed in the Paris conference, but surpassed them. And again, we see that in the Defense Command paper, UK envisages a transformational shift from conventional mass mobilization of troops to deployment of advanced technology assets for neutralizing security threats. And they have identified cybersecurity and space as focal points. And the UK's carrier strike group will be deployed in the Indo Pacific. And this will be an occasion for port calls, ship visits, and joint exercises of our air, ground, and naval forces. So India recognizes that as the center of gravity shifts to Asia, so will the global players. We are a net security provider in the region and the first HADR responder in most such events. Our prosperity and security has historically been linked to the seas. Currently, 95% of our external trade involves sea transport. So we are obviously committed to keeping the Indo-Pacific free, open, and inclusive. While our sea borders are protected by a blue water navy, we see merit in ever closer international cooperation for protecting sea lanes of communication, sustainable fishing, preserving peace in the entire region, making it inclusive, free, and open. And our two nations have long-standing partnerships and strategic equities in the Western Indian Ocean region. So as a force for good, we can and must, as Ambassador Sujan Chinoy has mentioned, work together to address terrorism and extremism. And India would be happy to see investment by UK companies in our industrial corridors and to include transfer of technology and joint ventures. And the overall aim is to co-create, co-develop, and co-produce new technologies, including and especially a neglected sector, which is our cooperation in defense industry and defense technologies. So we're both investing to upgrade capabilities of our forces in niche domains like artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum technology, and cybersecurity. And obviously, India has a lot to bring to the table. So when our two prime ministers meet in person or virtually, the finalization of a number of MOUs and agreements in all these areas are very much on the cards. In all areas, it will only help if India and the UK consult and coordinate more. And that is where institutional dialogue will go a long way in supporting the work of both governments. So I'm confident that I will have the support of High Commissioner Alex Ellis in this endeavor of joining our think tanks as often as possible. And I thank Brigadier Vikramjit Gill, the military attaché in our High Commission, and Joint Secretary Sandeep Chakravarti for their role in quickly moving the files. So once again, with thanks to both the DGs, I look forward to hearing from the experts on this panel. Thank you and Jai Hind.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That was fantastic. Now let me pass the virtual floor over to High Commissioner Alex Ellis, and I haven't had a chance to congratulate you on your new appointment. So over to you, Alex.
That's fine. You can hear me okay, Karen? So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I just echo at the start Dr. Von Hippel's comment about the situation here. You know, our thoughts, if you're living in Delhi in India at the moment, are very much on the COVID situation, and all that we can do to help, we must. The first of which is to make sure we stay at home and reduce contact. And I apologize that because of the current situation here, I won't be able to stay for as much of this session as I'd like. I should also, can I just thank Rusi for that help and a lot of the brain and thinking which went into the integrated review last year, which obviously I was heavily involved with, and Rusi had an absolute fundamental point playing that. And I'd like to thank ITSA as well for hosting this, Ambassador. Let me just throw in a few points, and I often follow Gayatri, and she says all of the good things. So I would just agree very much with what she said. Just pick out a few points, if I may, Karen. So number one, the UK never completely went away from this region. We actually have 7 points of presence in the Indo-Pacific today. So actually, there's something to work from, so that's kind of point number one. Second point, I think our kind of strengthening of our presence is about defense and security, but a lot more too. We have to think about people-to-people things. We have to think about research. We have to think about trade and investment. You know, it's part of a whole suite, and I think I wouldn't want us to be seen as simply a defense actor in this region, but actually as a more present country in this region. I really agree with what others said. The kind of drive. I mean, I think Karen, at the start you said, despite COVID, I'd say because of COVID, actually, it's accentuated the push towards the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the response to COVID by different countries, I think. And Gayatri was saying about an open and free Indo-Pacific, and this does have a sort of a philosophical part to it, if that's the right word. And it's not just about defense, it's also about being open for a purpose, for being open and free. And two democracies such as UK and India, I think, have an important role to play in that. I'd like us to think about scope, and I mentioned that before, so not just defense, and I would include security as well, so some sort of non-defense aspects of security in this. I hope people will think about geography in Indo-Pacific, because conceptually, I'm reminded, and please can any Indian listeners on this call correct me if I'm wrong, but I was told the other day, and I hadn't realized it, that in the partition of 1947, and I shouldn't talk about that too often, but included some bits of the Middle East, so parts of Yemen, which were part of the Bombay Presidency until 1947. So there's always been a geographical concept of India which goes across the Indian Ocean to land on the other side. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we are talking about, and I mentioned those 7 points of presence. Those 7 points of presence include Kenya, as well as the Middle East, where of course we're a big contributor to the Combined Maritime Task Force. So let's think about our geography here in particular. And finally, the non-geography, the bits which don't, so space, cyber, it strikes me that those are also elements of an Indo-Pacific tilt. So we have to think beyond geography as well. So I'm sorry I can't stay for longer, and I'm delighted that you are, that together Itza and Rusi are organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That was excellent. And the great thing about, another positive thing about the pandemic is it enables us to bring in people from many different places like today. So it's a great example of having two High Commissioners on. Let me see if Ambassador Chinoy has any final comments before we pass it over to my colleague Virle to chair the next panel. Ambassador Chinoy?
Thank you. I think both the High Commissioners have made very relevant points, and I entirely agree with High Commissioner Gayatri Issa that we have complementary capabilities and that we are natural partners, and that our partnership should go beyond the expediency of the current healthcare challenges, such as cooperation in the field of vaccines, to also celebrate the existing cooperation on clean energy, solar energy, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and above all, the point that she emphasized, ramp up cooperation in the defense sector. Because we've seen since the 1950s and 60s that India's reliance in this field has shifted in favor of formerly the Soviet Union, thereafter the Russian Federation, more recently the United States, Israel, and many others. So there's great scope here as well. And we must consult and coordinate much more. And with High Commissioner Alex Ellis, I entirely agree. And 7 is a lucky number. So we are looking optimistically at your presence here in this region. And I also agree with you that the geography is very important, and that in this case, given the history of the region, the connectivity that exists, not just going back to the recent past, but over centuries, these two oceans have been intrinsically connected. And therefore, there are parts of East Africa and the Gulf in particular that are part of this whole concept. Thank you for reminding us about space and cyber as well. With these few words, I think Dr. Hippel wanted me to turn over to inform you all that we are now moving into our first session, a very interesting first session, which is titled India and the United Kingdom, Priorities in an Age of Geopolitical Competition. We have as chair Ms. Verlyn Novens. She is Senior Research Fellow of the International Security Studies section at RUSI. And may I at this juncture also say a few words about the chair. She leads the Navigating the Indo-Pacific program out there. She focuses on geopolitical relations in the Asia-Pacific region, including China's foreign policy, cross-strait relations, maritime security, and ASEAN. And prior to joining RUSI, she worked for the European External Action Service at the delegation of the European Union to Singapore's political press and information section. And in this role, she made considerable contributions. She focused on EU-Singapore bilateral ties and Europe's role in Southeast Asia. So with these few words, I now hand over to the chair of the next session, that is Ms. Verlin Owens. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy, and it's a pleasure to be here today and to already have had such a fantastic opening panel to really frame some of the issues that we're going to be discussing today. So good morning to everyone here in London and good afternoon to everyone joining us from India. I've already been introduced, so I'll skip right ahead to introducing our fantastic panelists today. I'm delighted to be chairing the panel on India-UK priorities in an age of geopolitical competition. So some of the questions that we'll be addressing today are, why is the Indo-Pacific important to the UK and India? What are the geopolitical and strategic priorities of the two countries in the Indo-Pacific? How does China impact the UK and India's specific priorities towards the region? How can the UK and India take one another into consideration in their respective approaches and visions towards the region? And are there any specific kind of roles or priorities or points of convergence that we can see in alignment in both approaches? So joining us today for this panel are Dr. Neil Melvin, Director of the International Security Studies Department here at RUSI. Neil's research focuses specifically on emerging international security dynamics in key regions around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific region, and with a particular look at the western part of the Indo-Pacific region. So looking forward to hearing more about that. And secondly, Ms. Shruti Pandalai, who is Associate Fellow at the MP IDSA. Ms. Pandalai works on India's foreign and security policy and is currently working on projects that focus on evolving geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, including sharp power contestation. So plenty to talk about with our two speakers here today. The format of our session is as follows. I'll ask both speakers to briefly make some introductory comments of around 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience for the Q&A. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll try and get to as many questions as possible. We have a short panel today, so please already go ahead and submit those questions as early as possible. But to start us off, Dr. Melvin, please give your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Virlo, and it's really a pleasure to be on this panel today, and I'd like to express my appreciation of the opportunity to work with MP-IDSA. I think the developing think tank contacts between India and the UK are going to be very important in helping to consolidate this new relationship that's beginning to emerge. We've already heard from the two high commissioners. In terms of the questions of this panel, I think High Commissioner Ellis has already covered some of the key points that I wanted to make, but what I would like to do, I think, is just situate this emerging bilateral relationship in the wider thinking in the UK about international security and the growing competition that we're seeing in different parts of the world, but in particular the Indo-Pacific. Because while, as the High Commissioner mentioned, the UK has never left the Indo-Pacific region, I think what we have seen over recent years is certainly a growing interest in the region. I mean, I would contrast the visit of Prime Minister May in 2016 with the proposed visit of Prime Minister Johnson, which has now had to unfortunately be postponed because of the tragic situation with the COVID. But nonetheless, I mean, we've seen an enormous shift in that period. And I think the tone and the optics around those two visits really reflect that. Now, part of that from the UK side is, of course, the Brexit factor and the ambition to now develop a global Britain agenda. But I would say that that's only part of the story. It runs much deeper in the UK. And in fact, while the integrated review famously identified the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, in fact, the tilt has really been already underway for some years. Now, a lot of attention has been on the defense and security aspects of that, and we've seen, of course, the visit of the new UK aircraft carrier to the region this year, been talked about for some years, and that has built up that expectation. There's been a UK investment in military infrastructure, I think, which allows that kind of deployment to happen. So we've seen new facilities in Oman, an investment in those areas. So there is certainly a growing military and security interest for the UK, but again, as the High Commissioner highlighted, I would think that that has perhaps got a little bit too much attention versus actually what is happening in terms of the broader interest of the UK in the region, and of course the partnership with India in that context. And at least one part of that, of course, is the whole issue, the debate about China, where we've seen in the UK, I think, quite a dramatic shift over the last 12 to 18 months in the way that China has been perceived. Initially, I think it was viewed as primarily a global challenge to the rise of China, growing competition, and in specific sort of national dimensions to that challenge to the UK, notably around technology. And we saw just about a year ago the whole shift of the UK on the Huawei question, in which UK basically moved out of Chinese telecoms infrastructure to a large degree, but also the question of Hong Kong and the way that China has violated the agreement there. So growing, of course, evidence of what's been going on in Xinjiang in terms of human rights violations, the way China has handled the pandemic in some instances. But above all, I think it's also been the tone of China's diplomacy, which has mobilized opinion often against it, sort of the opposite of what diplomacy is supposed to do, and raise wider concerns. So the tilt itself, I think, brings together a number of those things. And of course, the last element is a realization that the Indo-Pacific is the future for major growth and markets, and that's where much of international trade growth is going to be, and the UK would like to be, I think, contributing to that and building partnerships. So in fact, when we look at the integrated review itself and the tilt, I mean, I think, and the Defence Command paper that went with it, certainly there is an ambition to contribute where appropriate and helpful on the security and defence side. But at the heart of the integrated review are issues to do with diplomacy, that the UK understands that, in fact, partnerships are going to be vital for it to play a positive role in the region. And so a partnership with India, I think, is going to be a central aspect to that. A recognition that while the UK has never left the region, of course, the region is a very complicated space. There are many different interests. The UK isn't going to just arrive with solutions already to issues that the region has been struggling with. So the UK perhaps needs to do its homework first and begin to understand regional perspectives, and also look for where the region and the voices in the region think that the UK should and could play a role. So I think this is why we also see an investment by the UK in diplomacy, but also in things like the defence attaché network being strengthened to help better understand that. And that, I think, can build a realistic engagement. And I think the Indian High Commissioner rightly said it's a transformational moment, but it's going to be a transformation that's going to take some years. And even in terms of UK capabilities, realistically, we're looking at sort of a 10-year time frame before the UK begins to have the capabilities on the defence side beyond the aircraft carrier group, I think, for a sustained military engagement. So those, I think, are some of the issues that are informing the UK decision-making and thinking. I think the integrated review signaled that the UK doesn't have a fixed view on the region as yet. And of course, the China issue is a matter of concern, but there's also a realization that China is a country that we're going to have to find ways to work with in certain areas, even while competition and indeed some kind of deterrent aspect may be important in others. So that's going to be a difficult issue. India, of course, is fundamental to this. There's a historic relationship, but I think there's also a clear convergence of interests between the UK and India. We've heard about that desire to work together more closely. across a whole section of different issues, including, of course, the people-to-people dimension, which is also already very strong given the strong South Asian presence in the UK. But I think that's going to be anchored further in terms of other sectoral areas for working together. And the last point, I think, in terms of the geography, I mean, we at RUSI, I think, are trying to think a bit more about what the Indo-Pacific means to the UK. And of course, there are many different definitions of the geography of the Indo-Pacific. But I mean, realistically, I think that a center of gravity of a UK presence is likely to be, to some degree, in the Indian Ocean. We've seen that as part of the re-examination of aid priorities, that East Africa is going to get a greater focus, reflecting sort of the Kenya engagement by the UK, but also the Western Indian Ocean as a maritime space. And I think there's very much a ground for cooperation with India on maritime security issues, and perhaps also working together with third countries on maritime issues, where some of the littoral African countries could benefit, I think, from UK-India cooperation in that area. But perhaps I'll stop there and look forward to some questions.
Neil, that's fantastic. And thank you for giving us also a little bit of an introduction to just the Indian Ocean region dynamics and where the UK could really focus on. I mean, this is something that RUSI has already, of course, done. A few years ago, we had a UK-India maritime dialogue where we actually specifically focused on points of convergence, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean. So if anyone wants to read that, it's on our website. Please have a look. But speaking of regional perspectives, with no further ado, I will hand it over to Ms. Pandalai.
Thanks very much, Virle. This is, good afternoon to everyone in India. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in London. Your Excellencies, Dr. Karen Von Hippel, Ambassador Sujana Chiroi, our distinguished participants. I'm truly grateful to the organizers for an opportunity to join this conversation today. It's a real privilege, and I wish you all good health in these trying times. After the practitioners have sort of spoken so comprehensively, I mean, there are little for me to add, but I think there is, as you had mentioned in your opening remarks, Virle, let's try and situate this conversation and put a few broad ideas on the table. So when you asked me for the Indian view, Ambassador Chinoy, our High Commissioner in London, they've sort of provided you the perspective. But really, the Indo-Pacific theater of India today is a geostrategic and geoeconomic priority. Under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, we've seen a clear articulation of India's vision for the Indo-Pacific, which is open, inclusive, and equitable, and emphasizes security and growth for all. So, in fact, it is an evolving vision which is not hunkered down by exacting geographies and is anchored in the realization that India will naturally play a key role in the evolving Indo-Pacific, given its geographical location, vast coastline spanning 7,500 kilometers, and the fact that 95% of its trade moves by sea. It also reflects its aspirations to be a leading and enabling power in the region. So the vision is underlined by shared interests, as the speakers before me have spoken about, and values, and looks at an open and inclusive, balanced region, which is connected by secure seas, integrated by trade and investment, and underpinned by the rule of law. So it's a natural evolution of India's Act East policy, which reiterates ASEAN centrality and also prioritizes the needs of India's immediate neighborhood. Of course, this understanding is also tempered by contemporary realities of the rise of China and its increasing assertiveness. 2020 was clearly an inflection point for China's relationship with the world, but also in the India-China relationship, and that has impacted our strategic choices. We're also aware that plummeting Sino-US ties impact all geographies. And for those of us who are watching closely, this does not come as a surprise, but perhaps made strategic options clearer. So from the Indian point of view, more multilateralism, not less, diversifying partnerships to find solutions to global challenges which have been amplified in the post-pandemic global order are really India's intended goal. So in a sense, preparedness, partnerships, and the promotion of a network region are now the cornerstones of India's vision. India, as previous practitioners have spoken, seeks a multipolar Asia, and its vision for the Indo-Pacific is anchored in this pursuit. Closer home checking of unilateral action, especially on its land borders and in the Indian Ocean region, has really driven India to push back, not just by bolstering internal capacity and preparedness, but also through external engagement. In fact, in the broader region, the Indian Foreign Minister has popularized the articulation of the India way in the Indo-Pacific, where it showcases its capacity to provide solutions to many challenges that burden the Indo-Pacific nation, and the lines of effort have been calibrated on multiple fronts. This, of course, includes being the first responder and preferred partner in the Indian Ocean region during the COVID outbreak and developing a cutting-edge pharma sector for global good. We've also made some very bold choices in terms of deepening strategic cooperation with partners in the quadrilateral dialogue, France, the United Kingdom, Singapore, South Korea, as well as enhanced engagement with the European Union, West Asia, and Africa, with a focused cultivation of Pacific Island states, as well as the Indian Ocean states, where all of these have become strategic priority. Defense cooperation has been broadened via joint exercises, strategic dialogue, maritime surveillance and capacity building, as well as HADR operations, with a vision of further institutionalizing networks of cooperation. We, of course, have a session coming up right after this, so I won't go into too much detail here, but that's really been a significant push. Diplomatically, high-level consultations to give practical shape to India's Indo-Pacific vision have been undertaken through plurilateral diplomatic consultations like the Quad Plus, D10, fronted by the UK, the global alliances on artificial intelligence, etc., which are all examples of a varied range of partners. India has also sought to leverage its bilateral relationships to bolster India-led multilateral platforms. The Director General of IDSA mentioned the Global Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Similarly, the High Commissioner of India in London mentioned the question of the initiative on the International Solar Alliance. Now we've also tabled the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which has basically aimed to bring together like-minded countries in the region to ensure economic and security cooperation is deepened for all partners in the Indo-Pacific. Over the years, we've also seen an emergence of crisscrossing of networks in the Indo-Pacific region, giving rise to institutionalization of a series of minilaterals, which are focused on specific outcomes of trade, technology, connectivity, third country cooperation on quick impact projects, and deepening security cooperation. So the traction for issue-based coalitions is really growing. And if we take the case of India alone, groupings like the India, France, Australia, India, France, Japan, Japan, US, India, Australia, Indonesia, etc., have come up with many tangible solutions. For example, the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative between Japan, India, and Australia is aimed to rewire global supply chains that are either independent or minimally dependent on China. We have strategic communities of France, India, and Japan who have been putting their heads together to develop multilateral norms for the digital economy and promote sustainable growth. Similarly, Japan is bringing its core competencies to take the lead in developing the connectivity pillar of the India proposed Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. Now, these are just a few examples, but it's clear that the blueprint for delivering results in the Indo-Pacific is the focus of all of these coordination efforts. Now, for instance, the Quad Summit's recent push to develop core competencies in vaccine development and delivery, climate change, critical technologies, etc., are stemming from the realization that managing the many disruptive challenges in the post-pandemic global order, including that of a rising authoritarian superpower, will require collective action. Importantly, for tangible results, this could only happen if all sides built on each nation's strengths. So capacity building has become the thrust of this agenda. If it was happening in bursts and starts in the past, the mandate would be to sharpen the aim, set timeframes, and avoid duplication of effort. So in short, if I were to conclude, it is within this large canvas of building networks that India welcomes the United Kingdom still to the Indo-Pacific. The political churning over managing the China relationship, diversifying partnerships to balance transatlantic concerns, and demands in accountability in international governance all mirror India's concerns. The Indo-Pacific in particular provides low-hanging fruit, we relate to your question, for this partnership to deliver. And as Neil has pointed out, there's a lot of priority areas in maritime security, connectivity, counterterrorism cooperation, and building consensus on interests, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean region, that both sides can do. Apart from this, of course, the issue of development of blue economy, there's immense scope to collaborate on that. India is carving out a normative work in its leadership for its principles stand on sustainable connectivity. The United Kingdom's success in terms of development assistance, providing sustainable infrastructure, which is underpinned by trusted legal frameworks, can buttress India's efforts. So whether it's coming together on 5G technology, there's greater potential there. But most importantly, I think, as the ambassadors have mentioned before, the partnership between Oxford University, AstraZeneca, and India Serum Institute actually provides a blueprint for future cooperation on global health initiatives and demonstrates that India and UK can work together to provide tangible solutions to serious global challenges of the hour. So opportunities are abound and the political momentum is now here. I'll stop here and I look forward to more question and answer discussions.
Thank you, Shruti. I mean, that was a wealth of information, and I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. I mean, we've got a few questions on the Quad, rather unsurprisingly, so I wonder whether I could just quickly ask you each a question. Neil, the point was made that France, of course, already has a very significant presence in the Indo-Pacific and is also participating in joint exercises with the Quad. I mean, is this a problem for the UK? How does the UK integrate itself more in some of these frameworks and some of these unilaterals? And Shruti, there was a point on there being two Quads in the Indo-Pacific. We usually speak about one and we forget about the other in the Pacific Ocean. Is there a possibility for a Pacific 7 that brings all these countries together and that includes the UK's assets in the Middle East and in East Africa, which we already touched upon earlier today? Neil, do you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Viola, and thanks for the question, whoever posed it. No, I mean, I think what we're seeing is, although we've been focusing on the UK today, that there's a growing interest, I would say, across Europe in the Indo-Pacific. And so we've seen there's the UK integrated review paper, but there's been a number of other strategies. France, of course, was out first, reflecting, I think, the fact that, of course, France has quite extensive territories in the Indo-Pacific, and a large number of French citizens are in the region and economic interests. But the Netherlands, Germany, the European Union has just issued one. So I don't think in any way that there's a kind of a competition amongst Europeans, but there, as part of, I think, what Shruti highlighted, the need to build networks and sort of burden share, there is space, I think, for a conversation about how we can all best cooperate around the shared goals. And so I think that may be what we need to look at in the future, and in particular how, on the European side, how France and the United Kingdom, we'll be looking at military issues anyway, how they may be able to join up a bit their engagement to help other Europeans also make a positive contribution on the maritime security side, and that there are ambitions on the EU to do that. So I think that there's definitely a common interest amongst European countries to do that. I mean, the UK's IR didn't actually mention the Quad, as far as I'm aware. But I think the reality is going to be that the UK, as indeed France is doing, will be cooperating with Quad members and around the Quad, and that may sort of emerge into other kinds of partnerships going forward. But I think that that's going to be the reality of security across the Indo-Pacific. There's multiple actors, there's a lot of flexilateralism, but there are also, I think, clear shared goals, and what we need to do now is try and make this all fit together. So of course the UK-India relationship, which is I think developing quite quickly, is going to be an important pillar, I think, particularly on the Indian Ocean side in that context.
And Shruti, in terms of expanding that network Indo-Pacific wide to a grouping of 7, I mean, do you see that from an Indian perspective as being something that would be helpful or desired?
Thanks, Virle. I mean, this is, I'd quickly pivot to something a discussion that happened in a recent Raisina dialogue, which is held by the MEA. And a question was put actually to the foreign ministers of France, India, and Australia, where the host asked him about the sort of institutionalization of the Indo-Pacific region and the overemphasis on the Quad. And I think each of them came back with a statement saying that, look, Let's not, impose structures on a region that is evolving at the moment. In fact, the foreign minister of France had an excellent quote in this matter. And he says, in this matter, we have a very pragmatic approach when we talk about setting up an inclusive area, an area of cooperation. I'm not sure we should always start by talking about some very complex matters, institutional matters, because if we do so, we waste the time and we're never sure what the outcome will be, unquote. So in a sense, what I'm trying to convey is at this moment, I think the networks of partnerships are building, issue-based coalitions where, issues drive partnerships are gaining momentum. So should we expand it? Right now, I think we're looking at deliverables. Which countries can come together on particular issues and deliver tangible results will be the need of the hour. So I'll leave it that.
We're going to extend the session by 5 minutes. So I'll just ask one other question that came up as well pertaining to China. Now, the specific question was, how can India and the UK cooperate in checking the advancement of China in the Sea of Vietnam, or to other people, the South China Sea? Are there specific ways in which you think you can collaborate in this space? Or maybe just extending that question a little bit more broadly, how do India and the UK also engage with China in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, the point was made that from India's perspective, the Indo-Pacific is open, free, but also inclusive. And we've seen in various Indo-Pacific strategies that this also means opening the door or keeping the door open to potential engagement with China. So do you see also potential engagement point of convergence between the two countries? Maybe Neil first, and then Shruti, and perhaps I might call on Ambassador Chinoy to also just very quickly make some remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I mean, China is obviously an important aspect to the UK's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but as I said, this isn't all aspects of it, and it's not all about deterring China. It's also about trying to work with China on some issues. I mean, we have to keep that aspect open, that dialogue aspect open. So I think we need to look at this issue across quite a wide variety of different dimensions. So, I mean, of course, many people will start with the rules-based order, and we'll see that the UK probably will reaffirm its commitment to that, particularly in the South China Seas on the naval side. But I think going beyond that, there's a lot of other things, and this may be where there's perhaps more scope for UK-India cooperation on issues to do with maritime security. So it's about anti-piracy, it's about anti-smuggling, it's about stopping illegal fishing, some of which, of course, involves actors from China. And of course, I think this is also about reaffirming that the region itself has a diversity of actors and stakeholders, and they all need to follow sort of shared sets of rules. So I think that rule building and reaffirming role is certainly one that the UK and India can cooperate on, and that will have an impact. Then I think there's others, of course, which is emerging technology. I mean, obviously, India has a very important role in that area. That there's a growing, I think, perception that technology has a national security component to it, and so we need to look for diversity of options in terms of technology. We've seen that around telecom. So I think, again, that could be an arena in which there's already a lot of, I think, interplay between entrepreneurs in the UK and India on the private sector side, but perhaps a little bit more strategy between the two governments on how to tie up that on those issues.
Thank you. Shruti, do you want to add some quick comments?
Sure. I completely agree with Neil. So if there was a short answer to your question of is China driving alignments in the Indo-Pacific region? Sure. However, but I think, like Neil mentioned, we also need to see that if you look at the recent outcomes of many of these bilateral, trilateral, plurilateral discussions, including what came out of the Quad Summit, the focus on expert vaccine groups, critical technology, climate change, and broader aspects of maritime security are covered. And it proves that there is an attempt by all countries involved to institutionalize cooperation beyond the China question and actually provide alternatives to countries in the Indo-Pacific which would like to exercise that choice. So I think that's the emphasis here. So for example, India has been working in many countries in the Pacific with like-minded countries like Japan in terms of undersea cable optics. These are new areas, rare earth elements. These are new areas of cooperation which have come up, and I think that's where the focus will lie. So yeah, I think while the China question remains important, and the conversations on equitable global governance will continue to dominate. However, the fact remains that I think to provide tangible alternatives, I think countries who are interested to work together will have to go beyond the China question and institutionalize networks of cooperation which are delivery oriented.
Thank you. I wonder if I could see if Ambassador Chinoy very quickly wants to come in.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be brief. Look, the Indo-Pacific is actually, as we see it, open to all who play by the rules. But the problem here is that China does not wish to play by the rules, and nor does it accept the rules as they are made by others. So we have a fundamental issue here. The second fly in the ointment, if I might put it that way, is the emphasis on democracy as it seems to be, sort of reverberating through the Quad statements. Now that in a way excludes China, but for that matter, it also excludes some of the ASEAN countries at a time when we are also speaking of ASEAN centrality. So there's a dichotomous situation there which needs to be resolved. The third point is that the Quad is a different kettle of fish altogether. It is a grouping of like-minded countries, and the expansion is not guaranteed, nor does any fifth country have a lien on membership. There is no automaticity to participation in the Quad. We must remember that. The last point is that as far as land borders are concerned between India and China, we do not expect anyone to come and pick our chestnuts out of the fire. So that is a given. But there is much that India and the UK can do together in terms of generally, exchange of information, intelligence sharing, whether individually with the UK or with the Five Eyes, this can be done. And lastly, when Dr. Neil also spoke about the Western Indian Ocean, the point in the Western Indian Ocean is that the UK does have a little historical baggage there. So while it's true that you never left the Indo-Pacific, in a way, it's important to kind of leave with a clean break and come back in a different incarnation, because the legacy issue in the Western Indian Ocean is a bit nettlesome when it comes to the issue of Diego Garcia and the ICJ and the UNGA resolution, etc., because that has a kind of splitting effect in terms of the very consensus that we're trying to build. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. There's so much that we could go into, but I think that today really offered just a quick snapshot or a flavor of some of the work that we'll be doing, hopefully also together with IDSA in the future on the Indo-Pacific and on the bilateral relationship between the UK and India. So thank you to both Neil and Shruti for their fantastic comments, and to Ambassador Chinoy, of course, as well. It is my pleasure to now hand over to Major General Dr. Bakshi, who will chair the next session on India-UK defense and security ties. Just as a very brief introduction, Major General Bakshi is Deputy Director General of MP-IDSA. He is a former Indian military officer with experience across operations, training, cyber and information warfare, and has served 5 years in the Parachute Brigade and over 2.5 years in the National Security Guard. Dr. Bakshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Verle. It's been a wonderful afternoon so far. So I'll say good morning to our UK friends and a very good afternoon for the Indian participants. So it's a privilege for me to chair this session, which is on our defense and security ties in particular, and coming in partnership with the oldest think tank in the world, that is RUSI. Well, coming now to this session, the Indo-Pacific region has been discussed so far. It is of prime geostrategic importance for all stakeholders in global trade and prosperity. We've already spoken about these issues. We want stability, we want security, we want freedom of navigation and overflight. All these we feel are critical to global economic growth as we look at the blue economy, regional cooperation on a host of issues, going from disaster relief to pandemic management to countering terrorism. Now, all these issues are of great significance for all the nations in this region, and they're already included in the stated objectives of the Quad leaders in the recent APEC dialogue. Now, India, being a key stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific, we welcome the interest being shown by like-minded nations in this endeavor, particularly a nation like UK, which has historical ties with the region and a considerable involvement even in the post-colonial era, as was earlier mentioned, that you already have these points running from Kenya to Brunei. You already have about 7 points where you have presence. Now, India and UK are natural partners, and we have some bilateral working subgroups to the defense consultative groups who are making efforts to develop our relationships. We also have an annual exercise or a biannual exercise Konkan with the Navy. We have the exercise Ajay Warrior for the Army. We have extra exercise Indradhanush for the Air Force. So these are all the opportunities we have to take forward our defense and security ties. To talk to us on these issues, we have our two panelists for this session, Mr. Aditya Dave from the RUSI. Let me introduce him. Aditya Dave is a research analyst focusing on South Asia in RUSI's International Security Studies Department, and he's a part of the Navigating the Indo-Pacific program. His research interests include South Asian foreign policy, regional security, and strategic dynamics, as well as the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and maritime security in the Indian Ocean. From the Indian side, we have Colonel Vivek Chadda. He's a research fellow with us since 2011. He has earlier served in the Indian Army. He's commanded the 1st Battalion of the Maratha Light Infantry Unit. He's into research here with us. His areas of research include counterterrorism, countering terrorism finance, and military issues in the Indian context. He's a prolific writer. He's already authored 6 books individually, and his next publication deals with the ongoing integration of the armed forces in India. He's also on our editorial board of the Journal of Defense Studies, which is one of our 2 flagship journals. Now, before I come on to the specific question, which I will ask the panelists to field for me, I will just request all the panelists and the participants, if you have any questions, please put them into the question and answer box, from where I will pick them up at the end of this 10-20 minute session. Now, coming firstly to Aditya. So Aditya, how do you see UK's defense cooperation strategy in the Indo-Pacific in particular evolving in the coming decade? And whom all do you see UK engaging with to take forward this strategy? Yes, over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, General Bakshi, very much, and for that question. It's very good to be here at this webinar with IDSA. Just on your question, I think as highlighted by the first panel as well as by Ambassador Ellis, the UK's role in the region is sort of evolving. There is a realignment of its sort of commitments over the next decade, particularly as there's also reduced effort in Afghanistan, etc. And there's going to be realignment of assets in the region. The UK, of course, already has important partners in the region, ranging from the United States, Australia, Japan, Singapore, and as you already mentioned, has multiple points of presence across even the Indian Ocean region. It does prioritize a number of different things, of course, as it emerges out of Brexit. It looks at economic opportunities in the region, but also on the security side, freedom of navigation, securing the flow of trade and energy, and also priorities in non-traditional security issues like piracy, and for that purpose, and attempt to enhance the maritime domain awareness. Coming also to specifically the India relationship, the multiple panelists have spoken about the integrated review. I'll speak a bit about the Defense Command paper itself. India was mentioned as a key pillar for the UK's priorities in the region, with a particular emphasis on defense industrial cooperation, defense education, training, interoperability, and an emphasis particularly on maritime partnerships in the Indian Ocean. Given the UK's sort of stretched capacities, again, as mentioned by previous panelists, in both the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, there's going to be, the UK is most likely going to be engaged in a number of different issue-based coalitions, which are becoming quite the norm in the region, as also highlighted previously. A number of different trilaterals, a number of different issue-based coalitions, particularly on the issues that I mentioned about. In terms of cooperation with India also, something that's been pending for quite a while is I think the stationing of a liaison officer at the Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region in Gurugram, just outside New Delhi, which is India's effort to enhance maritime domain awareness across the region. Of course, there's also anticipation of a logistics support agreement being signed between the two countries in the coming weeks or months, similar to what India has already with the US, Japan, Australia, Singapore, South Korea. And particularly in terms of both the integrated review and defense command paper, one thing that emerges is a sort of different framing of India from in UK policymaking and strategic thinking from what has been the case perhaps in the past in terms of how the UK views regional security in the region. In South Asia, and a seeming dehyphenation perhaps of India from more localized security questions, which has been the case before, which is something I think is probably viewed positively in India itself. Another priority that comes about is defense industrial cooperation. I think the Indian High Commissioner mentioned co-creation as a priority, and there is an attempt to build business-to-business linkages between the sectors in the UK and in India, and in particular also the importance of dialogues was highlighted in both the integrated review and the defense command paper. So clearly both the countries have a fairly strong technical cooperation, but something that's been missing perhaps is a higher level political strategic convergence and coordination. And sort of the implementation of these higher level dialogues, I think, will be crucial to moving the relationship from just technical levels to more strategic convergence and coordination. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think that leads me very nicely to the next question, which I was thinking of asking Vivek. So if the full dimensions have not been achieved as what was being mentioned just now by Aditya, Vivek, what do you think have been the challenges which are constraining the full potential of India-UK defense ties and the security partnership from opening up? And how do you see it improving in the future?
Thank you, sir. I think Aditya has underlined a number of the issues which I thought I could probably further highlight. And I will get into some of the challenges that have been faced in the past, because I think it's important as to what exactly is the takeoff level and where are we moving from to understand the kind of enhancement of both the level and the qualitative shift that has been seen in the recent past in the relationship. So if you look at the differences, I think one issue where we have differed to some extent in the past is related to terrorism, because there are, I think, two issues where one could probably look at that. One, of course, is how we look at Pakistan. As far as we are concerned, I think we've been very, very clear that the issues taking place up north in Jammu Kashmir are essentially the core of the issue is related to terrorism, which not merely emanates from Pakistan, but for which Pakistan is directly responsible. And I think there have been some issues in terms of how we've looked at Pakistan in the past. I will, of course, come to shifts which have taken place since, but I think that has been one issue which has been a little bit of a troublesome issue. The second issue, of course, is that there have been segments, however small that they may be, who have voiced their support in terms of the separatists in India, whether they being the so-called Khalistani groups or groups operating in Jammu and Kashmir. So that again, I think the kind of actions that we've seen in the recent past, not as much in the recent past, but at least in the past, I think that is something which has been a little bit of a concern for us. So I think this is one issue. The second issue, of course, is that the UK has been a very major defense partner for us, commencing from the independence period. Over a period of time, there has been a reduction or a dilution of the quality and the quantity both of the kind of defense relationship we've had, whether it's in terms of the equipment procurement profile or it's in terms of training partnerships, exercises. I think there was a little bit of a dilution there which took place over a period of time. I think the other issue which I'd like to underline is that, and of course, this I will also underline it from the perspective of the UK a little later. But the fact is that India's policy towards defense imports, defense manufacturing, and co-development has seen a marked shift in the last couple of decades. Unlike a lot of countries which have actually evolved very quickly to some of these shifts, whether it's in terms of France, US, Israel, I think the UK has been a little bit behind the curve in terms of the kind of partnerships we could have potentially developed, given the kind of excellent takeoff point that we had both commenced from. The next issue, of course, is there were apprehensions in terms of what exactly is going to be the impact of Brexit on the defense and security relationship, because there is some kind of a structural reset that is taking place. Of course, what we can make out is that it seems to be moving in a positive direction, which is appreciable. But that was again one apprehension. It brought both challenges and opportunities, I think, at the end of it. I think from the UK side and from the industry side, I would put across points to be fair to them. There was talk of the procurement policies not always being entirely predictable in India's case, and I will delve into some of these issues a little later. The second thing which came up was in terms of the level of assimilation or the level of technology assimilation that existed in both the countries. And it was felt that any kind of co-production or sharing of technologies needed an equitable level, which did not always exist in industries on both the sides. So it was a challenge that the UK side faced. Similarly, there were limitations in investment in the defense sector, also because of the constraints or limitations in terms of how much, in terms of percentages that could be invested in India in the past. So I think these as a gist, were some of the challenges which were faced in the past. Let me come on to where we are today and where are we moving from here, because I think there has been a fair shift and fair movement that has taken place as far as these issues are concerned. We are all aware that a consultative group is in place, which is headed by the Defense Secretary and is equivalent on the other side. And there are a number of subgroups which have been created essentially to enhance cooperation in the field of both defense and security. Simultaneously, I think I should also give some suggestions, possibly, which could look at enhancing the level of cooperation in defense and security. I think there was mention of cyber, there was mention of space. I think it's not a bad idea to look at some of the areas and perhaps more as possible subgroups in the future as part of both defense and security to take the partnership forward. As far as military training is concerned, the fact that we are having this webinar today and the fact that we have, as I can see, more than 100 participants who are party to the discussions today, I think this indicates an opportunity for players on both the sides to enhance their interaction and to use platforms possibly we were not as comfortable with in the past, one of the positives that probably COVID has brought to us. Looking at defense manufacture, if I look at the trajectory of how the Indian defense manufacturing has moved, it's been a shift from emphasis on public sector to private sector to joint production, joint development. And I think that's where the key lies in terms of how future defense manufacturing is likely to move. And that's possibly the reason why there was a degree of unpredictability in terms of how we've looked at defense policies. And it's been a shift which has taken place in just about 2 decades' time. If you look at the Defense Expo 2020, you look at the Aero India 2021, there has been repeated emphasis on bringing in technology. There's been repeated emphasis on manufacturing in India, and there's been repeated emphasis on getting the best OEMs to come and partner with the defense industries in India, which over a period of time have actually started coming into their own. So I think there is a lot of scope for work there, and there's a lot of opportunity which exists there. And like I said, some countries have shown their keen interest. A lot of partnerships have begun. Of course, the UK partnership is there with the Mahindra & Mahindra for armored vehicles. Of course, the Hawk is being now assembled in India. But the fact remains, I think there is much more that can potentially be done in this field as well. as far as the issues regarding the limits on the participation, I think to a great extent, the direct route has been increased to 74% FDI with permissions to 100% as well. So there is a scope that exists which did not exist in the past. And I think it clearly indicates the intent of the government in welcoming not merely foreign capital, but also foreign technology and foreign companies. There was also a talk of the defense corridors. The ambassador spoke about it. And I think that is again an intent where the government, the state governments, the public sector, private sector, R&D companies, all have been brought together on a singular platform. And the kind of push that has been given by the government is quite evident. And I must also take it forward to a very important fact, and that is that India is not merely looking at participation so that companies can come and produce for India. Equally importantly, we are looking at exporting defense equipment, something that we did not do as much in the past. And I think any company that comes into India and participates as part of defense manufacturing will also be a part of the defense export network, something that, again, like I said, it was not really a point for emphasis in the past. The final factor as far as the defense manufacturing is concerned is where the private sector stands today. There is a positive list of items which have been created for the private sector where they can solely create, produce in partnership with companies from abroad. So I think that's yet again an opportunity for partnership between those companies and the private sector. So I think that's a very important factor. Finally, of course, the government-to-government route has been a preferred way in the Indian context in terms of how we've been procuring in the past. It has been highlighted by a number of scholars, I think at RUSI as well. So I would like to re-emphasize that I think the UK has not been as forthcoming on this as probably, again, some countries have been in the past. And I think there is possibly a lot of scope for work there, and maybe a lot of coming together of the energies of the two countries as far as this is concerned. The other point relates to technology, and we did speak about technology. In the past, the emphasis has mostly been on selling platforms. I think there has been a diversification of how we look at defense today. Technology on its own is something that today can be traded, that can be shared, that can be co-developed. So it's not merely a finished product that can be sold. I think there is a lot of scope, and this is where the smaller companies, a lot of startups come into play, which have niche, very high degree of understanding and knowledge base that exists in both the countries. And I think there's a lot of scope for cooperation as far as these smaller entities are concerned. I think I'll stop here. I won't take more time here. Maybe move on to the question and answer hereafter.
I was just going to stop you and request you to wind up because we're running out of time. But before we go on to the participants' questions, I'd like to draw both of you out a little bit on the counter-terror cooperation. While I'm thankful for a number of issues which have been brought out, counter-terror cooperation is one low-hanging fruit which I feel, both countries could have easily reached out in a much better manner. I can personally vouch for the rapid progress we achieved with the SO-15 after a visit I had been hosted there as a part of the NSG. We started exchanging real-time data on bomb-related incidents and IEDs immediately after that. So on email, on a daily basis, we could exchange data and we could share knowledge. We also have some annual or biannual visits for the SAS exercise Temple Guard, but not much has moved further on this. So I'd like both of the speakers to talk a little bit about the scope for enhanced counterterrorism cooperation. Yeah, first, Aditya, could you go?
Yeah, thank you, General Bakshi. Yeah, I agree with you that counterterrorism is obviously a very important area of cooperation for both countries. Both countries have experienced obviously varying levels of terrorism over the years. And however, as you mentioned, in spite of these sort of common interests, there has sometimes been friction, particularly in terms of, I guess, politics. There's always been strong technical cooperation. As you mentioned, there's always been these regular exchanges between sort of the NSG, SO-15, and between a number of different entities, including sort of even at a diplomatic level. But at a political level, obviously, there's a perception of threats by the Indian state, which often brushes up against norms in the UK of sort of freedom of expression, etc., which can cause tensions. But of course, there's been this joint working group on terrorism since 2002, and they have had, I think, about 14 meetings since then. So there is obviously regular interaction between the governments on this. And over the years, we've seen the mandate and the scope of interactions on terrorism-related issues expand to include things like financing, to include things like online radicalization threats, online online terrorist-related threats, and so I think the scope of cooperation on this issue is quite substantial. Specifically, also on the counter-IED cooperation, as you mentioned earlier this year, there was a UK-India counter-explosive ordnance virtual symposium that was organized between sort of the two industries, which was an engagement sort of between the two UK and Indian industries for sort of sharing best practices and to discuss the common challenges faced by both countries. So there is an incentive to work together. And as you mentioned, that this is quite a low-hanging fruit in that sense. But of course, there are political tensions. And I think in that sense, similar to how the trajectory is in other areas of defense industry cooperation, there's also an element of bringing industry closer in this sense. In addition to the political cooperation between two governments, I think the sharing of information and sharing of best practices between the industries, particularly in terms of both capacity building, etc., is quite crucial. And I think there's clearly incentive to continue working in this area. I'll just also speak about the greater role of counterterrorism cooperation. There's been a convergence in many ways also on multilateral fora between the two countries. We've seen the UK co-sponsor Masood Azhar's nomination at the UN at the United Nations, and also co-nominate sort of Pakistan in the Financial Action Task Force for addition to its grey list. So there is a convergence of interest in this regard. Also, I think things have moved a little bit in the UK since, from a few years ago when there were clearly issues expressed from New Delhi in terms of the UK's approach. We've seen a number of times that the UK has sort of called out terrorist attacks emanating perhaps from Pakistan that were carried out within India and Afghanistan in that sense. So those statements have come from the highest levels. So there is a shift in that regard, even in the UK. But sometimes I do think that the political issues can create frictions.
Thank you for that. I think I'll just move on to some of the questions. I think whatever he's already spoken on terrorism, I just request Vivek not to take that. There's a question from Sneha on UK-India cooperation on cybersecurity, and how do you see this going in the future? So can I request Aditya again to take this on?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very good question. Clearly, that's a different, it's a relatively new area of cooperation between the two countries. But there is an established cybersecurity dialogue that happens between the two countries. I think it's one of the few dialogues that the UK hosts on a bilateral basis. The UK has on a bilateral basis. There has also been regular interaction, I think, between the computer emergency response teams between the two countries. And I think there is a lot of sort of interaction, engagement that potential, particularly on the protection of critical infrastructures. And we've seen recently in India, there's been clearly attacks on India's critical infrastructure, which coincided, I guess, with the confrontation with China on the border. And I think this is also an issue in the UK. I mean, Sneha herself is our cybersecurity expert at RUSI. And so I think there is clearly potential there. Of course, in recent times, I think there has been concern from numerous countries outside of India about the trajectory of data localization policies, etc., within India. But at a sort of sharing of best practices, a capacity building level, there is clearly scope for engagement.
So thank you. So there's a question and a comment from Vice Admiral Sinha from our side, where he's saying that there is much scope of cooperation in science and technology and defense production. So I'll request Vivek to talk a little bit about this. But he's also mentioned that Royal Navy should get its force levels enhanced to enable it to have a higher presence in the Indo-Pacific? There's one more question coming up on that later. And the political alignments between the two countries will largely depend upon the convergence of the two countries in demonstrable action against terrorism, both on the ground and in the UN Security Council. So I think the terrorism part has been covered. I'll request Consider to give a little bit more on defense production and science and technology.
I think I covered the issues related to defense production in detail during my introductory talk. So I think there is absolutely no doubt that there is scope, and the scope has actually transformed in the recent past. And it has transformed primarily because of how India views today its defense production policies, defense exports, the fact that Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India is a mantra which is not only relevant to other areas of the industry, but particularly to the defense industry as well. And the second shift, which I mentioned earlier, I'd like to underline, is that from a public sector oriented defense backbone that we had in the past, there is a very clear and discernible shift which has taken place towards the private sector. So every single policy initiative, the defense procurement policies that have come out in the recent past, they all seem to suggest that defense production is a priority, co-development is a priority, joint research and development is a priority, and I think joint research and development with the private sector is a priority. And anything that is required to give a fillip to this kind of a partnership and to bring in the OEMs into this framework is, I think, what the emphasis of the government has clearly been. So this, I think, in terms of defense production is the broad understanding of where India stands and where it intends to move.
Thank you so much. The last question I will just ask Aditya is a lot of interest generated even from the question answers, even otherwise, on the movement of the carrier battle group, including Queen Elizabeth, into the Indo-Pacific. So the question is, would the focus of this carrier be in the Indian Ocean region or in the Pacific region? And would this be a long-term deployment? Is it going to be frequent or infrequent? I'll request you to answer that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that deployment of the Carrier Strike Group is a very important sort of symbol of the UK's interest and engagement in the Indo-Pacific. But I think it was noted in the integrated review, but that the primary focus of the carrier itself and the carrier it'll be more oriented perhaps towards the Euro-Atlantic than the Indo-Pacific itself. The current deployment would, I think, sail through the entire region, but I don't think we know the specifics of the route and where it's going to have sort of port visits and port calls, etc. But I think we can expect that it will do so in a number of key countries, particularly as I think mentioned by you before in terms of exercise Konkan. I think in recent years, there's been concern that the exercise has diminished in size. The deployment of the Carrier Strike Group and the potential engagements that it allows for exercise Konkan in the near future, I think that'll be very useful to ramp up the exercise itself. I think in terms of the UK's general deployment in the Indo-Pacific, rather than the Carrier Strike Group itself, I think we're looking more at what in the Defense Command paper I think was mentioned is the deployment, persistent deployment, as it was put, of offshore patrol vessels in the region. And I think this could provide an interesting avenue for cooperation between UK and India. Clearly, in the region itself, there is a lot of emphasis placed on what are known as non-traditional security issues like illegal fishing and smuggling and piracy, and as well as the monitoring of exclusive economic zones. India, of course, carries out a number of these exercises with countries and island countries in the region, and I think this would be a useful avenue for engagement between the UK and India, because offshore patrol vessels are essentially extremely useful for such purposes. I think the UK also has a number of existing assets in the region. So I think, as highlighted already, the number of points of presence. And so I think rather than the strike group itself, which is an extremely, I think, important and symbolic deployment and allows opportunity for engagement with not just India, but a number of countries in the region, I would look at some of the other more, perhaps smaller, more pragmatic, but more sustainable deployments that the UK is planning.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time. we've been able to go through some of the issues which have been holding back the full potential of our defense cooperation, and how you've given some excellent ideas how to take it forward. So with that, I think I'll have to close the session, though there are a number of other questions here. But at this point, I'd like to close the session and hand over to Shruti, please.
Thank you very much, General Bakshi. And after that fascinating session, all I'm left to do is to thank all those responsible for enabling this rich discussion. On behalf of the Director General of MPIDSA, Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy, I would like to thank the Indian High Commission in London, particularly Ambassador Gayatri Sarkumar and her team for initiating this discussion, as well as the contribution of Ambassador Alexis Ellis, the High Commissioner of the UK to India. I would also take the opportunity to thank Dr. Karen von Hippel, Neil, Virle, Aditya, and other colleagues from RUSI for their partnership. I hope this is a start of many more exciting and productive conversations of the future. I acknowledge the contribution of the Deputy Director General of MPIDSA, Major General Bipin Bakshi, as well as Dr. Jagannath Panda, Research Fellow at MPIDSA, who contributed to the planning of this event. Let me end by thanking my colleague, Colonel Vivek Chadda, as well as all the participants for provoking such a vibrant discussion. I hope this dynamism is reflected in the deepening of our bilateral ties and the upcoming virtual summit. Thanks very much.